Welcome, Laura Lake-Smith, measuring the in-between, movement and difference in Richard Tuttle's wire pieces.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to the Metabody organizers. Thank you so much for having me. Richard Tuttle is an American artist whose work has varied in medium and scale since the beginning of his career in the mid-1960s. Yet for all of their variations, Tuttle's objects retain several consistencies. As seen in the examples on the screen, they are seemingly unfinished and invariably abstract in form and content, eschewing representational imagery and overt subject matter. Moreover, Tuttle's works are often constituted by unassuming materials, such as rope, florist wire, twigs, bubble wrap, or cardboard. These everyday materials can appear as both two-dimensional and three-dimensional, and suggest an oscillation between the mediums of painting and sculpture, as if one is experiencing the object in process. Because of his unconventional mediums and his in-process objects, Tuttle's work is generally regarded as post-minimalist, a branch of abstract art that was impacted by, but expanded beyond the hard-edged materiality and the reductive ideology of minimalism. Post-minimalism employs more malleable mediums such as film, felt, latex, as well as the body. And here you see some examples of Bruce Nauman, still from one of his films, one of his latex pieces in the middle, and a Robert Morris felt piece. These pliable materials allow for the emergence of gesture, texture, and irregularity, and temporality, all of which emphasize the manipulation of the mediums and underscore the very processes of art making. But more so than his fellow post-minimalist, Tuttle's art revels in the process as such, because it is, I argue, invested in imaging a metamorphosis, an artistic practice further underscored by the fact that Tuttle creates his objects primarily in serial production, each work as if a moment in an ever-evolving process. Exemplary of Tuttle's process art and his seriality are the wire pieces of 1972, 48 sequentially made objects comprised of a pencil line, a shadow line, and a buoyant piece of florist wire. At first glance, a work like the 44th wire piece is almost imperceptible on the luminous walls of the gallery. Relative to other post-minimalist art, this piece is small in scale, measuring at about 4 feet by 2 feet. Its delicate lines of wire, pencil, and shadow intertwine so much so that it is difficult to disentangle and discern the individual elements. Yet as one observes the piece from varied viewpoints, it appears to simultaneously materialize and dematerialize. But these humble figures, these fragile elements, seem resilient, quietly sustaining a sense of form as process. The extant scholarship on Tuttle's wire pieces is laden with observations of movement, transience, and impermanence. Many have noted that the wire pieces border on between the permanent and the impermanent, the visible and the invisible. One curator in particular has commented that the wire pieces force viewers to interact in a kinesthetic fashion with an art object that seems to be in motion. Indeed, the 44th wire piece seems to be amid some slight and palpable movement. But I argue that this movement more precisely indicates a flux, and thus it is a form that can only image the in-between. Such mutability is manifested in varying degrees in each of the 48 wire pieces. While it can be argued that the individual wire pieces themselves manifest a sense of metamorphosis, An examination of the wire pieces as a whole amplifies perceptions of movement and flux. Although the objects share the same constitutive elements, each of the 48 wire pieces varies in some fashion from the others. Unlike conventional serial production in art, which usually evinces sameness or consistency in repetition, Tuttle's objects insist on difference and heterogeneity. But to what end might these wire pieces manifest an errant seriality and an art of the in-between? Let's begin in an unlikely place again, with the origins of art and the story of the Corinthian maid. In Pliny the Elder's account of this well-known fable, art originates as a resistance to loss and impermanence. In anticipation of the departure of her beloved, the young maiden traces the outline of his shadow with the help of a lamp that projects his silhouette onto the wall. It is a mimetic process whereby her beloved's presence will be preserved. In order to concretize the tracing, to lend it permanence, the maiden's father, a potter, later forms a clay relief atop the shadow. Here, art, in both two-dimensional and three-dimensional forms, is the solution to problems of disappearance and loss, solutions that have, since antiquity, permeated the history of art, which remain rife with ambitions of imitation and the perfect copy. From the Corinthian maid to Richard Tuttle's wire pieces seems a significant leap, yet several things recommend their comparison. As with the work of the maiden and her father, Tuttle's wire pieces are concerned with the shadow, with the entanglement of the second and third dimension, with the notions of impermanence and loss. But, as we shall see, Tuttle's works do so towards radically different ends. First, consider how a wire piece is made. I'll have to use this to point, so I'm hoping you can see some of this. To start, here, the pencil line is drawn in freehand on the wall, an abstract line that Tuttle says he draws intuitively. Either one or two nails are then placed alongside the pencil line, and the florist wire here is then wrapped around the nails, manipulated, its shape seemingly conforming to the drawn line, even if not precisely. It acts as if a three-dimensional correlate to the two-dimensionality of the pencil line. The last element of the wire pieces, shadow, emerges as an effect of the gallery lighting, casting the shape of the wire as shadow. If it can be said that certain points of Tuttle's process here brings to mind the story of the Corinthian maid, I contend that it does so with the intentions of revision. As I will later argue, the emergence of the shadow as the last element of the wire pieces has significant implications for conventional ideas of artistic creation. But first, let's examine a bit of the series. In the first wire piece, three elements are relatively congruent with each other, so much so that in this particular slide, it is difficult to separate them. Yet the second wire piece makes for a marked contrast. Here, the pencil line forms an arc, but the wire, secured with only one nail in the middle of the piece, cannot mime the pencil line. Without the support of the nail, the wire sags with gravity, an errancy that is likewise echoed in the shadow. In these pieces, 4th and the 6th, the 9th and the 12th, I'm here showing you several selections, 39th and the 44th, the mimetic failure is further and variously exaggerated. In spite of obvious attempts that have been made to shape and force the wire to the pencil line, something about the arrangement always prevents the wire from conforming, a failure that is then amplified by the shadow that it casts on the wall. As you can see, the relationships of the elements within the discrete pieces and then throughout the series is always one of difference, never sameness or mimesis. The 47th and 48th wire pieces are Tuttle's last in the series, and like the previous pieces, they demonstrate the utter failure of conformity. Yet the incongruency of the constitutive elements is dramatically punctuated in the final work, the 48th wire. In the 48th wire, the synthesis between the wire and pencil line is pragmatically unfeasible, given the two parallel lines, one nail, and only one short piece of wire. As the last in the series, it is the piece with the most incompatible elements, and here the singular wire acts especially defiant. It curls upwards against the drawn lines, rejecting the predictable paths of parallel lines, those Euclidean equidistant lines that will never converge or diverge. As the series evinces, the wire's tracing, its conforming, or its copying, is continually upended in its repetition and its varying degrees of difference. In this way, of course, Tuttle's wire pieces bring to mind Deleuze's philosophy of difference and repetition, a philosopher whose emerging career emerges alongside Tuttle's. As Deleuze would encourage, and is illustrated by, I argue, in the wire pieces, creation is never a process of imitation or resemblance, but is always a production of that which is different and ever new. To be sure, the last piece of Tuttle's series, here in the 48th wire piece, is anything but a pronouncement of finality. It is only an arbitrary ending, such that if allowed, the series could continue infinity. But for the entire series, we must think about this. It is dramatic expression that suggests something conversely to the story of the Corinthian maid. That here, in the hands of Tuttle, art can never successfully accomplish the goals implicit in that story. For why make a series like this if not to suggest that these objects are not and cannot be resolved, concretized, or made to conform? Yet the difference in repetition of the wire pieces do not solely hinge on the unfolding of the discrete objects in series. Indeed, any given wire piece is different in each of its installations. Briefly consider the following examples. Between two installations of the 10th wire piece in 1972 and 1986, notice the changes between the pencil line and the wire. Although recreated by means of a template, first initiated by Tuttle in 1972, the pencil line is always redrawn in freehand and thus will always differ. The wire operates differently too, having been stored around a spool when not on display. And of course, with the wire, so too the shadow. Similar differences can be seen in other pieces, as in the installation of the 44th wire piece in 1986 and its recent installation at the LA MoCA, and in the 48th wire piece between 1972 and 1986. As a series that is deeply invested in a repetitive but differentiated process, Tuttle sequentially made wire pieces are in an incessant production of the very possibility of difference, and a process which is only ever indicative of something that is always becoming something else, a process which echoes a Deleuzian becoming. Initially developed by Deleuze and later expanded with Guattari, becoming is a process in which something never is, but is only a force in metamorphosis and generation. As Deleuze and Guattari insist in 1,000 Plateaus, becoming, quote, has neither beginning nor end, departure nor arrival, origin nor destination. A line of becoming has only a middle, end quote. Indeed, becoming is about an in-betweenness and what might be produced fleetingly in the middle. And speaking of the middle, let us return to the shadow, which to this point has received the least attention, but is, I argue, the most important element of the wire pieces. The contingent and unpredictable shadow is produced by the play between the pencil line and the wire. It is easily confused for the other two elements, for it is similar in shape to the wire, but closer in tonality to the pencil line. Thus the shadow not only emerges in between the effects of the pencil line and the wire, but it is also in between the qualities of the pencil line and wire. Nevertheless, it is a real, tangible, and sustaining element of the wire pieces, most necessary for their constitution. Contrary to Pliny's account and the story of the Corinthian maid, the shadow here is not a reminder of loss or a means to concretize a copy. Nor does one find here resistance to the shadow, its immateriality, its contingency. Instead, as we shall see, the shadow of the wire pieces becomes an agent of resistance. In closing, I turn to another story about shadows, that of Plato's allegory of the cave. Created by the light of the fire in a deep cave, shadows of puppet figures are cast onto the wall in front of chained prisoners. Unable to turn around to see that puppeteers produce the shadows, the prisoners in the cave believe these spectral appearances to be real. Plato contends that the shadows are not real and insists that the really real is to be found outside of the cave, in the full light of the sun, where shadows disappear, and where a prisoner can see that the puppets and their shadows are merely different levels of imitating reality. Plato is most dubious of art, which he believes can only falsify the truth, and of course artists are among those that he bans from his ideal republic. Thus the puppets and their shadows, as emblematic of his problems with art, are in opposition to Plato's immutable theories. For in some sense, Plato's goal is a world without shadows. But the wire pieces undercut these Platonic beliefs by calling attention to the shadow. Indeed, they embrace the shadow, appearing in piece after piece and always with difference in all of its mutability and its impermanence. Ultimately, and most platonically, the shadow becomes a vehicle of truth, which demonstrates in the series that the real is always in flux and amid creation. The real, the tangible, the sustainable. It is as if Tuttle's wire pieces cry out, "Let the artist back into the Republic," as it is art that can expose the falsity of the immutable and the reality of the coming. And while Tuttle's series has many significant implications for the history of art, the value of Richard Tuttle's wire pieces for us today, among the concepts that are under consideration here, are in their relentless unyielding to conventional forms, in their rethinking of artistic creation, and in their ever increasing production of possibilities and the real. As Deleuze and Guattari would insist, the real is never self-same, timeless, or predictable. Rather, it is a dynamic nexus of flux and indeterminacy that is generative of the very conditions from which we become. For in the constant yet inconsistent shadow that emerges between the effects of the pencil line and the wire pieces reveal that in betweenness is happily Genesis. Thank you.